All right, welcome to the second episode of the Global Report podcast. I'm Morgan Dawicki, and with me, as always, is co-host Professor Bill Lawrence. Bill is actually joining us from Nepal for this episode, which is really exciting, really making it global right off the bat here. So, Bill, tell us why you're in Nepal.
So I was invited by National Defense University, who were the chair for Near East South Asian Studies, is a friend from my graduate program. But also because he has lots of people to choose from. I've been giving a lecture for a good 6 or 7 years now at National Defense University on countering violent extremism that they feel is the best to situate the topic for audiences that the U.S. government trains around the world in CVE. CVE, a concept invented by the United States and modified through various administrations. And I was directly involved in what was under the Bush administration called Muslim World Outreach. I was in charge of aspects of it. And in the Obama administration, what was rechristened Global Engagement, or Global Engagement to Muslim Communities, which was the same thing, which was a piece of the countering violent extremism approach of the U.S. after 9/11. And so I gave the keynote lecture and moderated some other sessions. I've asked to be a discussant, and we have representatives of about 10 South and Southeast Asian countries who work directly on countering violent extremism, which is kind of an extension of counterterrorism, often a soft side of counterterrorism, which I can tell you more about if you have a question. So we're trying to get these people to think outside their box, their nation, their experience, look at best practices from other countries. Again, from a bunch of really interesting places, where I haven't met a lot of people since I'm more of a Middle East, North Africa guy, Africa at times. But this is my first trip to Nepal. I've been to Malaysia once for the State Department and all over the Middle East, but and I've stopovers, little short things elsewhere. But this is my first time in the Himalayas, and I've been singing the Cat Stevens song. It keeps going through my head, Kathmandu.
Yeah, that's too funny. So why Nepal? Why is the event going on there? Is it geographic specific to the event, or was it just a good place to meet up and meet with these countries?
So part of what they deal is with interfaith, and so here we're dealing with Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam. India and Pakistan have a lot more terrorism than the West does. It's just we hear about our terrorism more, but statistics of hundreds per year of attacks. So the terrorism problems are quite bad out here. We have a lot to learn from them. They have a lot to learn from us. Nepal is a place. We're going to a temple in about 3 hours with a Harvard graduate that runs it here in Kathmandu, and he's going to explain various interfaith things that they work on. But it's all about bringing communities together. Part of a session yesterday, I talked about non-religious religious dialogue, which isn't talked enough about and featured in a big way in my research on the Arab Spring. So there's a religious side to this. There's a geopolitical and regional side to this, and there's just a lot of stress between India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Myanmar, a little further over. We have the Philippines here, other countries, and even the Nepalese have had their own insurgencies and instabilities, Maoist rebels, political instability, other extremist attacks, and so no country in the world is spared of the 193 or so, and we all can learn from each other when it comes to addressing extremism.
Yeah, so the reason I asked you that was exactly the answer you just gave me is really this region specifically for this topic doesn't get a lot of airtime. It didn't get a lot of airtime in your career, as you stated, right? You were more focused on Middle East, North Africa. And so this, I think, is interesting for listeners to get educated on the fact that this exists in other parts of the world. We just don't hear about it as much, especially in a place like Nepal, right, with that locality. So for the average listener, right, what is the difference between countering violent extremism, terrorism? How do we define the two differently? How do they interplay? Because these are two very distinctly different things, kind of playing on similar themes.
So according to this conference, I have 78 slides and 45 minutes to answer that question, because that was my question. But basically, terrorism is as old as human history. I give examples from the Greeks, Romans, and Persians. Often they are imperial responses that worked. or repeated responses that provoked more terrorism, and one of the things we learned through human history, and I helped develop a class with a professor of 9 other people from American University in the history of global politics, where we looked into all these things, is that terrorist organizations almost always die. Ideologies don't, but organizations do. They get defeated, and societies mobilize, countries get together, and they defeat terrorists every single time in human history. Another sort of rubric is that there are crazy, violent people in every country and every stage in human history, but when people start following them, you've got a bigger problem. You might use the word drain the swamp, but countering violent extremism is in part draining the swamp around bad people that want to do bad things, that want to make their personal vendettas and grievances into society-wide attacks on the government, which is what we see extremists doing all over the world. CVE was developed formally in the Obama administration, and it basically took mostly a toolkit of development practices and engagement with police forces, government officials of various kinds, civil society organizations, universities, and other local communities to try to do PVE, preventing violent extremism, or CVE, which that is included under, but CVE can also include returnees from prison, returning fighters from overseas, and other categories of extremists. And what it tries to do is enable the community and the individuals to not be extremist anymore. And again, a whole set of toolkits, a lot of it from the traditional development toolkit, but other things too. I spent, for example, one of the things that I probably have a lot of expertise in my own career, because I've also worked on CVE professionally. By the way, India keeps cutting the power to Nepal. They're not getting along. So the power just got cut here. I'm running this off batteries and cell phone because India keeps cutting the power.
Your phone just threw a thumbs up as well, the new iPhone update.
It likes India. so anyway, there's this various toolkits and various ways to, and I gave lots of examples, maybe 20 different countries and how they dealt with the powers back on. Thank you, India. There are various ways that communities can respond and root out these problems over time. And we're all bad at it, but we're all getting better at it, collectively. And again, I was starting to talk about how I've been involved in the trauma-based approach. I think the easiest way to think of it is the triple trauma of the terrorists that went to ISIS. So there are traumatic things that push them into extremism, traumatic things that happen them into the battlefield, and the trauma often of escaping ISIS, which many of them did, the ones that didn't get killed, and they were trying to keep them in the battlefield, right? And then returning home and getting re-traumatized with societies rejecting them for having joined ISIS and killed random civilians in their own countries and Europe and around the world. And so a lot of countries say, well, we're going to provide them jobs. Well, if you provide a job to a triply traumatized person, they're not going to be able to hold the job. They're not mentally there. So I talked a lot about the psychological and social service side to dealing with current extremists, returning fighters, people getting out of jail who need a lot more than just a job.
Right. So I think the distinct difference here, at least from the countering perspective, counterterrorism versus countering violent extremism, to put it in very simple terms, I think we're thinking of counterterrorism as we're going to stick it to them. We no negotiation.
Military, it's very well defined.
Right.
It's usually military. I mean, all this comes under counterterrorism, but it's usually military security forces. And everyone at the conference, including a lot of police chiefs, that are here saying we've had an over-militarized, over-security approach to extremism. It's not good. It doesn't work. It actually pisses off populations more. Yeah.
Yeah, CVE is more civic, an engagement, getting into the weeds of understanding grievances, understanding how do we provide these folks opportunity, what is their extremism actually rooted in, instead of trying to just eliminate them and see them as a threat and a problem. It's how do we get them more ingrained into society, eliminate the actual extremism piece. How do
By
you
the way, that's something your dad worked on in Algeria. We'll interview him someday about how he worked on that in Algeria, because he has experience in that as well. Yeah, go ahead.
So how do the institutions, the governments decide we're going to take one approach versus the other, in your experience?
Ooh, never had that question. I'll tell you a funny answer, and then I'll give the answer. So one of the sort of punchliney, half serious examples I give is the Aarhus model from Denmark. So one town in Denmark had an inordinate amount of foreign fighters that joined ISIS and went to the front lines. And when they came back in the 20s of people, so less than 100, right? The town decided, instead of just trying to give them a job, we're going to have a welcome party. We're going to provide them full social services of every kind with continual follow-up on a daily, weekly basis on everything, a job, housing, medical care, everything. And they're the only country in the world that had no recidivism. And I called it the hug a terrorist model, because in most societies, when the governments give scarce resources and scarce jobs to terrorists, people aren't happy about it, where there's unemployment and governments without enough money, So, and we spent some time yesterday about talking about how to do things with no money, when governments just won't pay for things. There are still a lot of things that government institutions can do: convening power, bully pulpits, getting people together, even when there's no money. But what they usually do is what they're already good at and try to implement it. I think that's the main thing they do. And so, for example, the Moroccans were way out ahead of other countries with religious education. So they did a whole bunch of amazing things in religious education and ignored other things, and so the countries tend to play to their strengths, and what they don't often do is play to their weaknesses.
Now, what does the average violent extremism group look like? Is there a way to categorize, or is it unique to particular societies, particular countries? Let's say religious backgrounds, ideological backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds. How do these groups come about? Where do their sort of grievances mainly come from?
That's huge topic. I mean, that's a 3-day answer, but I think the simplest thing to say is it's way more socioeconomic than otherwise. That there's an expert here who's Moroccan American who studied 850 ISIS videos and found that 10% of the content was religious and 90% was other societal grievances, often socioeconomic. Small groups of people get mobilized in country by various things, but in my research, and I've interviewed in my career well over 6,000 young people in the North Africa region, and at least a few hundred I would call extremists. And the common thread I found there is the humiliation at the hands of the state. Hogara, they call it. Hagaruni, they humiliated me, so I became an extremist. So that links to state behavior and governance being a major thing that everyone looks at as corruption's big, inequality's big, but humiliation at the hands of the state is a common thread. And then in the old days, they got together in person. Now they get together online. There's an excellent paper. It came out a couple of years ago from the Soufan Center that talks about how Salafists and white supremacists not only borrow tactics and memes and language and slogans from each other, but they're actually a bunch of Salafists that have become white supremacists in the States, in Massachusetts and Florida. And so there's also something about how extremists just want to be extreme, but the ideology doesn't have to necessarily be consistent with the last ideology they had. They just ready to be extreme. A lot of people get extreme in custody and jail, other people in various ways. But everybody's different. And one of the things I talked about in my keynote is how various models we have of the funnel theory, like you convert to Islam and then you get approached in a mosque, and almost nobody fits the model that we have of then you get radicalized online. It almost nobody fits it. There are anomalies in every individual and every organization, and part of the hard work of CVE is figuring out who you're talking to. So whether they're left-wing, right-wing, religious, secular, very virtual, or very, out in the forest, in the mountains, like whatever flavor of terrorism or of extremism you get, addressing them means really, really understanding them. Who's that Chinese war philosopher? Was it Sun Tzu? Sun Tzu, there's a famous phrase where he says, the secret to winning war is knowing your enemy better than he knows himself. And
Yeah.
I quoted him in one of the sessions, like you have to understand the mindsets and the psychology of particularly the leaders of the groups you're dealing with, better than they understand it themselves. Then you're ready to defeat them.
And it sounds like the ideologies are almost, they're the vehicle of delivery for the grievances, but they aren't the grievance themselves, right? It sort
Yeah,
of
we spend
builds
a lot
up
of
as
time
this
talking about how we
facade.
focus way too much on religion, for example, when
Yep.
religion's a way to express anger at the world. It's not the religion that's the problem.
It's the vehicle. Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
Now, have there been cases where, so we typically see terrorism as sort of transcending national boundaries. Oftentimes they're kind of becoming transnational. Do we see that with CVE, or is it more localized, regional, specific to certain countries?
All the above. So there's global aspects,
Okay.
there's regional aspects, there's national aspects, there's subnational regional aspects, and there's local aspects. But the most important single element is local. We talked a lot with the Indians, particularly about why parts of India were very resilient because there's strong social fabric and strong communities, and other parts of India are not because of various traumas that they've gone through, the stressors on those communities. It can be socioeconomic, but it can be war, it can be previous terrorism, it can be all kinds of things that can stress out a community and weaken bonds within a community. But local rules in this field, so you have to get hyper local in both your analysis and your interventions.
At what point do we decide, and obviously this is a case-by-case basis, but generally speaking, how do we decide this is a group we're going to consider a violent extremist group versus we're going to consider this a terrorist group? Is it oftentimes one instance of terror that really redefines the approach or causes countries to rethink their strategy and their decision-making based on the engagement?
There's a whole bunch of methodologies and approaches to answer this question. I think one to look at, if you want to learn more, is the Southern Poverty Law Center and how they deal with American right-wing extremism. And they sort of, I think they're the groups that are already proven to be violent, and then the groups that are getting ready to be violent, and there are also groups that are inciting violence. And you can be violent extremists, not just because you've crossed not just by expressing free speech about what you're mad about, right? But if I'm teaching you how to make a bomb that you're going to take somewhere and explode, we've crossed a line, even though you haven't bombed anybody yet. So FBI
Right.
has its definitions too. So there's I have studied, for example, on my own violent rhetoric, and there's a lot of violent rhetoric that's not violent extremism per se, because it's kind of normalized bullshit kids saying dumb things, like at soccer matches, and
Yeah.
I've written on this. So there's a normalization of violent rhetoric, sometimes in rap lyrics, internationally, not just in the US. And so rappers aren't necessarily violent extremists, right? But there's a point when you've crossed a line and you're, like in our criminal code, you're conspiring to rob a bank, or you're conspiring to kill
Right.
somebody. And so there's a point at which the conspiracy makes you a violent extremist. It makes you a threat to the state.
And that poses, I think, a lot of difficulties for those who work in the counter space, particularly organizations like the FBI, right? Especially when it gets into civil liberties. When this sort of thing is going on online, you also have privacy protections for U.S. citizens that are not afforded to foreigners. And so, especially at home here in the United States, it becomes a lot more difficult to intervene, to actually do something about these groups. And luckily, there have been few sort of instances of what would escalate up to sort of a level of terrorism that we would see, like we saw with ISIS several years ago here on U.S. soil. But I think, what is your view sort of on how we approach domestic CVE here in the US versus sort of the toolkit we have for doing it overseas?
I think the simplest way to think of this is violent extremists are constantly adapting to their context, and states are constantly adapting back to them. And states that are nimble defeat it faster, over months or years, and states that aren't nimble aren't. And the U.S. terrorists, whether Salafists, right wing, left wing, Antifa, violent Antifa, violent white supremacists, they all figure out how to operate within the U.S. system, and they'll use whatever tools they have, whether free speech or economic resources or whatever. And so what you have to do is do this careful dance where you develop tools that will beat them within the context of whatever values and rights you're trying to preserve. And it's an art, not a science. But just to give you a clue of what I'm talking about, we've had a hard time in the U.S. defining domestic terrorism, and we have to go further. We look at international terrorism. We have lots of tools, and then we won't apply them domestically because we're afraid. One of the things the Trump administration did is they took the CVE institutions and funding streams that Obama set up, and they said, this is only going to be a radical Islam now. We're not going to touch white supremacists. Why? Because they were supporting the Trump administration, and they wanted to. So they remade that into something called the TBVA, which was sort of defanged and became only about Islam. When the last year we have statistics, there were 3 Salafist attacks in the U.S., hundreds of white supremacist attacks, and a slightly smaller number of Antifa attacks, but a lot of the left too, And so one of the COVID years, we were looking at the data. So what states have to do is be nimble. But in the end, and getting back to the theme of today, CVE has to be partially about law and mostly about communities, because communities ultimately are going to bring people back, not laws.
I definitely think it is sort of that constitutional crisis, right? How do we define domestic terrorism without stepping over boundaries, without making it too broad that we're going to violate people's rights, their privacies, their freedoms? I think, but it also needs to be some reasonable coming to the table approaches, right? I think I recently saw one of the greatest tools that the U.S. has developed for overseas engagement has been the Global Engagement Center at the State Department, really born out of ISIS and their sort of widespread use of online content to do recruiting. And so GDC was really focused on targeting,
those were my guys at State. Yep.
Totally eliminating propaganda, volume of content, right? If you're able to wipe that off the internet, you're able to reduce sort of the capacity to recruit. I recently saw, I think this was a month or two ago, there was a proposal from some Republicans wanting to sort of defund the Global Engagement Center, which has a microscopic budget in comparison to the rest of the State Department, because of concerns over domestic privacy issues, even though this is really a tool designed for overseas combating terrorism and violent extremism. So what was your sort of level of engagement like with Global Engagement Center? What was that process like, kind of coming up with the initial schema and implementing it to counter ISIS?
So this will be the last question because I'm about to miss a bus to a Buddhist temple with all the people. So we'll take the last one. But I was involved in creating Muslim World Engagement, which became Global Engagement. I helped write a couple paragraphs in Obama's Cairo speech, a lot of the programs. A lot of those people were my colleagues. I was on 3 White House working groups, and so we were there at the high level strategy, right down to low level implementation. I think we learned a lot of lessons along the way. One of them was that counter narratives is important, but not as important as we thought. Including the messaging back, like tweeting back at ISIS when they say stupid things, on Twitter. Like it has a limit to it, and there are a lot of other things we tried and didn't do that well on. We thought entrepreneurship was going to help a lot, but entrepreneurship works for a certain subset of people, but so there was a lot of things we tried that it didn't do that well. I think if you were going to summarize all the lessons and put them together, and I have one slide that does this, like all the things that go into good CVE programs and good global engagement programs. You need legitimacy, you need authenticity, you need to deal with the full range of how people live, including their emotions, and their histories and their traumas. You have to have local community involvement in the development of programs from go. And you have to address the local issues that are causing people. So there's some analysis, what they call needs analysis up front and downstream. And then one of the big things we learn is we're always piloting because the government never has enough money for anything. And at some point, you just have to say, we're going to scale this to the size of the problem. We're not going to engage with 100 people or 1,000 people. We're going to deal with 50,000 people or a couple million
Yep.
people, who we want to point these programs at. Even if it's not perfect, we need to do it. And one thing about humans is they're either seeing things getting better or they're seeing things getting worse. Like a lot of people say, well, if it's not perfect, I reject it. Most humans, if they just see things getting better, if they see their state getting less corrupt, if they see the state spending more, if they see whatever the issues, environment, you name it, if they're doing more, that's usually enough to get things moving in the right direction. And so again, perfect can't be the enemy of the good. You just have to, at some point, you just get going. You listen carefully. You spend a lot of time co-designing with local benefactors, and then you test and test and test and see how it's doing. That's another thing, and follow up, and then look at what worked and what didn't work. One more thing I can say is the most effective de-radicalizers are formers. They call them formers, right? Former radicals, because they speak the language of people. But we have problems. We had a whole after session yesterday talking about when formers work and when they don't work. And you have to keep on sort of a short leash, not a long leash. Some of them are double agents for extremist organizations. So, but formers is actually one of the most effective ways because they say, I know I was radical like you. I know why you did it. I lived it like you. And the life can be better than just boiling the world into simplicities and wanting to blow everything up.